Before he became a legend of the skies, Dominic Salvatore Don Gentile was just a young man with a dream, born on December 6, 1920, in Piqua, Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants. Don grew up in a modest household with a fascination for aviation that took hold at an early age. From the moment he saw his first airplane in the sky over rural Ohio, Gentile was captivated. He read every book he could find on flying, followed the careers of American aces from World War I, and built model airplanes with meticulous care. By the time he was a teenager, he was determined to become a fighter pilot, no matter what obstacles stood in his way. In those days, flying was a privilege few could afford, but Don was resourceful. He took a part-time job at a local airfield, sweeping hangars and washing planes in exchange for lessons. By age 20, he had already earned a private pilot's license when the clouds of war began to gather over Europe. In the late 1930s, Gentile saw an opportunity not just to serve his country, but to become the kind of fighter ace he had always idolized. However, the United States had not yet entered the conflict, and Gentile wasn't willing to wait. Instead of standing by, Don joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941 and was assigned to the Royal Air Force's No. 133 Eagle Squadron, one of the 3 squadrons made up of American volunteers fighting for Britain. Flying the Supermarine Spitfire, he got his first taste of real combat over the skies of Europe. The Eagle squadrons flew dangerous missions, convoy escorts, sweeps over France, and dogfights with experienced Luftwaffe pilots. It was there, in the crucible of combat, that Gentile's natural instincts and raw courage began to shine. His fellow pilots quickly recognized his talent, while some were cautious and methodical in the air. Gentile was aggressive, always eager to engage. His flying style was daring, even reckless at times, but he got results. He claimed his first victories in early 1943, just before the Eagle squadrons were absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces. As the 4th Fighter Group, when the United States officially entered the war, Gentile transferred into the 336th Fighter Squadron of the 4th FG and continued flying out of England, now under American command. Gentile transitioned from the Spitfire to the P-47 Thunderbolt and finally to the aircraft that would make him famous, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was fast, agile, and had the range to escort American bombers deep into enemy territory, something the U.S. desperately needed to reduce losses over Germany. Gentile's P-51 was christened Shangri-La, a name inspired by the mythical paradise. Its polished aluminum fuselage and red nose would become iconic symbols of fear for Luftwaffe pilots. He quickly gained a reputation among bomber crews as a reliable protector. Where others wavered or broke formation, Gentile would press into swarms of enemy fighters to clear a path. He had a sharp eye, lightning reflexes, and a fearless commitment to his mission. He often returned to base with his aircraft riddled with bullet holes, but with stories of German fighters shot down and bombers saved. By early 1944, Don Gentile had established himself as one of the top American aces in the European theater. His string of victories climbed with each sortie. He flew multiple missions a day, often stretching the limits of both man and machine. He had developed a unique partnership with another ace, Captain John T. Godfrey. Together, the 2 pilots became known as one of the most dangerous duos in the air war over Europe. They watched each other's backs and worked in tandem to devastate enemy formations. But Gentile was not just a killer in the sky, he was a symbol back home. American newspapers started writing about the handsome young pilot from Ohio, the Italian ace who was downing German planes with incredible speed. Life magazine featured him. Radio broadcasts sang his praises. His kills were carefully tallied and celebrated as victories, not just for one man, but for a nation fighting to turn the tide of a global war. Don Gentile wasn't just living his childhood dream, he was becoming a hero, but his journey was far from over. Each mission brought new dangers, and the sky above Europe was still full of threats. Gentile had more to prove, more enemies to face, and a legacy to carve into history. The best and the most tragic chapters of his story were still ahead. By the spring of 1944, Don Gentile was no longer just another pilot in the 4th Fighter Group, he was its star. His tally of air victories had risen at an astonishing pace. With every mission over Germany and occupied Europe, he grew more confident, more ruthless, and more daring. Flying his P-51 Mustang Shangri-La, he made it his mission to protect the heavy bombers at all costs, often diving straight into enemy formations without hesitation. One of Gentile's defining characteristics was his ability to read aerial combat like a chessboard. While many pilots found the chaos of dogfights disorienting, Gentile thrived in it. He could anticipate the enemy's next move with uncanny precision, whether it was ambushing Messerschmitt Bf-109s or luring Focke-Wulf Few 190s into a trap. Gentile always seemed to come out on top. But he wasn't doing it alone. Flying with his wingman, Captain John Godfrey, the two became legends of the skies. They hunted together, covered each other's backs, and racked up a stunning number of aerial kills. Godfrey once said that flying with Gentile felt like chasing, lightning fast, intense, and always electric. On March 8, 1944, Gentile reached a new height of fame when he shot down 3 enemy aircraft in a single mission. 2 weeks later, on March 16th, he claimed his 20th kill. Each time he returned to base, ground crews would gather round Shangri-La to count the new swastikas painted on the fuselage, each one a symbol of another Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed. Gentile's growing fame caught the attention of the U.S. media and military leadership alike. General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally congratulated him for his bravery and skill. The press dubbed him America's Ace of Aces, and newspapers across the country ran headlines announcing his victories. Don Gentile was no longer just a skilled pilot, he was a full-blown national icon. Despite the pressure, Gentile never let up. Day after day, he climbed into the cockpit and soared into enemy territory, escorting bombers and engaging fighters with the same resolve he had shown. Since his early days with the RAF, he began flying more low-level strafing missions, attacking German trains, trucks, airfields, and supply depots. These missions were as dangerous as aerial dogfights, if not more so. Flak and ground fire were intense, and flying low made pilots easy targets. But Gentile loved the challenge. On one such mission, he attacked a German airfield and destroyed multiple aircraft on the ground before taking heavy fire and barely making it back across the English Channel. The Mustang was so damaged that it nearly broke apart on landing. Still, Gentile walked away without a scratch, grinning as if it had been just another ride. He also had a showman's flair. When asked to perform a demonstration for the press back at his base in England, Gentile agreed. In a moment that would become infamous, he performed a low-level flyby and attempted to roll his Mustang as a stunt, but misjudged his speed and altitude. Shangri-La crashed spectacularly into the ground. Amazingly, Gentile walked away unhurt. The aircraft, however, was totaled. The incident sparked controversy. The brass was furious. This wasn't a private air show. This was wartime. But the press and public couldn't get enough of it. In their eyes, Gentile was a hero with a touch of movie star swagger. A pilot who took risks, won battles, and lived to tell the tale. Still, the Army Air Forces knew that they couldn't afford to lose such a valuable symbol of American air power. Shortly afterward, Don Gentile was grounded from combat. He wasn't thrilled about the decision. Gentile didn't want to be a public relations tool. He wanted to keep flying, to keep fighting. He felt he hadn't finished his job, but orders were orders, and his superiors believed his role now was to inspire, to recruit, and to represent the success of the American air campaign over Europe. By April 1944, Gentile's official tally stood at 21 confirmed aerial victories, more than any other pilot in the 8th Air Force at the time. When combined with his RAF kills and the ground targets he had destroyed, his combat record was extraordinary. He had not only helped clear the skies for Allied bombers, but also inflicted serious material damage on German infrastructure and air power. Yet, with his combat career now behind him, Gentile was at a crossroads. He had lived for the thrill of the dogfight, for the sound of engines roaring and the adrenaline of survival. Being grounded meant watching from the sidelines while others carried on the fight. For a man like Don Gentile, it was a tough pill to swallow. Still, he returned to the United States as a hero. Crowds welcomed him. Newspapers ran feature stories about his exploits. Young men lined up to shake the hand of the Ace of Aces. He toured the country, met with fellow veterans, and war bond investors, and gave speeches urging Americans to support the war effort. But fame came with a price. Gentile would soon learn that transitioning from warrior to icon was no easy task. He had faced the dangers of the Luftwaffe and the perils of low-level attacks. But the greatest challenges of his life were still to come. Far from the cockpit of a Mustang, when Don Gentile stepped off the plane in New York City in mid-1944, He wasn't just a returning serviceman, he was a national phenomenon. The 23-year-old pilot was paraded through crowds, hailed in newspapers, and invited onto radio shows. His Italian-American roots, charming smile, and battlefield record made him a perfect symbol for a war-hardened but hopeful America. He was celebrated as the young man who took the fight directly to the Germans, who saved bomber crews and held the line over Europe's skies. But Gentile didn't wear fame comfortably. Behind the uniform and medals was still the young man from Pica, Ohio, who loved flying more than anything else. The transition from combat hero to American celebrity was not what he had trained for. Crowds overwhelmed him. The speaking engagements felt hollow compared to the intensity of escorting B-17s across enemy territory. He had built his identity as a pilot, not a poster boy. Back in Ohio, Gentile visited his family. He was proud to see the pride in their eyes, but he could also sense the disconnect. They saw a war hero. He felt like a soldier who had been pulled from the battlefield too soon. He missed the camaraderie of the 4th Fighter Group, the banner with John Godfrey, and the hum of the Merlin engine in Shangri-La as it climbed into a hostile sky. He had left something behind over the channel, something he wasn't sure he could ever retrieve. In public, he smiled and shook hands. In private, he grew restless. The war was still raging, and his brothers in arms were still dying over Europe and the Pacific. Gentile wanted to go back, to fly again, to finish what he started, but the military had other plans. He was assigned stateside duties, mostly ceremonial appearances, and training tours designed to boost morale and warp bond sales. He visited schools, factories, airfields, and even Hollywood studios. Everyone wanted a piece of the ace of aces. He did his duty with discipline, but his spirit dimmed. Gentile was built for the cockpit, for the speed and pressure of combat, not for speeches and staged photographs. He applied for reassignment overseas, but the request was quietly denied. The War Department saw more value in his image than his combat record. By late 1944, other aces began to surpass his kill count. Richard Bong in the Pacific was gaining fame for his victories against Japanese aircraft. In Europe, young American pilots were flying more missions, scoring more kills, and carving out their own legacies. Gentile remained a respected figure, but the spotlight slowly shifted. The headlines faded, and with them, so did the attention. After the war ended in 1945, Gentile faced the same challenge that haunted thousands of veterans. What comes next? The rush of combat had ended. The world had changed. Civilian life moved at a slower pace. And for those who had seen death from 20,000 feet, normalcy often felt hollow. He tried different paths. For a while, he worked as a flight instructor, training young pilots at various airfields, but nothing matched the thrill of combat flying. Civilian aviation lacked the urgency, the purpose, the fire that had driven him in Europe. Gentile struggled with his place in the post-war world. He was respected, but restless, decorated, but disoriented. The Air Force offered him a commission in the newly established United States Air Force in 1947, and he accepted. It was a chance to return to structure, to flying, to the mission he had once lived for. He hoped to find meaning again in the skies, though peace meant there were no enemies to fight, no squadrons to lead into combat. Still, he was back in uniform, and that gave him hope. He continued to train and fly, joining various units and gaining experience with newer aircraft. In a rapidly evolving post-war military, his flying skills remained sharp, and he was respected by younger aviators who had grown up hearing his name. Yet the past still clung to him, the days of Shangri-La, the chase over the English Channel, the feeling of being alive only when in danger. Gentile rarely talked about his kills or his fame unless asked. He wasn't boastful. His former wingman, John Godfrey, once said that behind the media persona, Gentile was deeply introspective. He carried the weight of those he'd seen lost in combat. He remembered the bombers that didn't make it home, the pilots who had flamed out over the Ardennes, the squadron members who disappeared in the clouds and were never seen again. There was pride in what he'd done, but also sorrow. Don Gentile had survived the war, but the war had never truly left him. In early 1951, as tensions rose in Korea, Gentile began training with jet aircraft. He saw it as a second chance, a way to reconnect with his roots as a combat pilot. Technology had advanced rapidly. Now the skies were filled with F-80s, F-8 for S, and other early jets. Gentile adapted quickly, mastering the new systems with the same intensity that had made him lethal in a Mustang, but fate had other plans. Later that year, during a routine training flight at Forestville, Maryland, Gentile's aircraft entered a steep dive and failed to recover. He was killed instantly in the crash. He was 30 years old. The news struck the aviation community like a bolt. The legendary ace, who had survived hundreds of missions and cheated death countless times over Germany, had perished not in battle, but in peacetime training. His passing was mourned by fellow veterans, generals, and ordinary citizens alike. For many, it felt like the final chapter of a story that had defined American air power during its golden age. But Don Gentile's legacy didn't end with his crash. In the minds of many, he remained the symbol of the fearless young pilot who faced overwhelming odds and refused to back down. His story lived on in Air Force halls, in flight schools, and in the memories of those who saw him soar. When the world learned that Don Gentile had died in a training accident, the response was immediate and heartfelt. Headlines mourned the loss of America's ace of aces, and tributes poured in from veterans organizations, political leaders, and military brass. Flags flew at half-staff on many air bases. His funeral was attended by family, friends, fellow pilots, and civilians who had admired him from afar. For the people of Piqua, Ohio, his death felt like the end of an era, but in the Air Force, Gentile's memory lived on with a special reverence. He wasn't just remembered as a top ace, he was viewed as a bridge between generations, a figure who connected the raw, prop-driven combat of the Second World War with the sleek, high-speed world of the emerging jet age. New pilots entering a world of swept wings and supersonic flight were taught the stories of men like Gentile not as history lessons, but as living inspiration. At training schools across the country, instructors invoked Gentile's name when describing instinct, aggression, and battlefield awareness. In lectures and manuals, he became a textbook example of combat initiative and aerial leadership. His tactics, his record, and his fierce loyalty to the bomber crews he escorted became case studies in what it meant to be a fighter pilot. The U.S. Air Force, only a few years old when Gentile died, was still building its identity. It needed icons, men who represented courage, adaptability, and precision. Gentile fit the role perfectly. He was young, skilled, daring, and absolutely committed to the mission. His story blended both grit and glory, the immigrant son who rose to become a national hero through talent, discipline, and relentless drive. And in the civilian world, his name carried weight, too. In newspapers and books published in the years after the war, Gentile was often listed alongside other great aces like Richard Bond, Thomas McGuire, and Francis Gabby Gabreski. He became part of the pantheon of American warriors who had defined the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Kids read about him in history books. Aviation magazines ran profiles with black and white photos of Shangri-La streaking across the sky. Veterans wrote memoirs and included stories of Gentile as a bold but disciplined leader. In Piqua, a local airfield was renamed in his honor, and his hometown embraced its native son with pride. They built a display dedicated to his wartime service, with a model of his P-51 and photographs capturing his rise from teenage aviation enthusiast to national figure. The message was clear. Don Gentile represented not just Ohio, but the very spirit of America's airmen in World War I. As the decades passed, Gentile's name remained known among aviation enthusiasts, especially within the community of warbird preservationists who rebuilt and flew restored Mustangs from World War II. For many of them, painting a P-51 in the colors of Shangri-La wasn't just a tribute, it was a statement. It meant carrying on the legacy of one of the greatest pilots to ever sit in a cockpit. The P-51 itself became one of the most iconic aircraft in history, and Gentile's name was forever linked to it. Museum exhibits on the Mustang often featured his likeness and kill markings, with captions explaining how he had used the plane not only to rack up an incredible number of kills, but to transform the way bomber escort missions were flown. His aggressive flying changed doctrine. His willingness to push beyond the norms set new standards. Even into the 21st century, his influence could still be felt in Air Force traditions, squadron patches, memorial flights, and official Air Force publications continue to cite Gentile among the most important figures in American aviation history. Too many young officers in flight school. He was more than a man, he was a legend. A mythic symbol of what a pilot could be at his absolute best. brave, focused, and unshakably loyal. But his legacy wasn't just about victories. It was about the bond he had with his fellow aviators, the sense that no one flew alone. Don Gentile embodied the belief that the mission always came first, that the safety of others was worth risking your own, and that there was a sacred responsibility in taking to the skies in defense of something greater than yourself. That message, more than any kill count or medal, was what truly lasted, long before the world knew him as an ace. Don Gentile was just a boy from Ohio with a dream that refused to stay grounded. He wasn't born with wealth, privilege, or powerful connections. What he had was passion, relentless passion for the air, for flight, and for pushing limits. That fire carried him across oceans and into the fiercest skies the modern world had ever known. It lifted him into dogfights over France and Germany and brought him home a decorated hero. But beyond the flying skills, the kill count, and the fame, Gentile remained, at his core, a humble, quiet man who loved to fly more than he ever loved the spotlight. In personal letters, Don often wrote not about his victories, but about his comrades, the men who didn't return, the bombers he couldn't always protect, the weight of responsibility that came with every mission. To the public, he was fearless. To those who knew him best, he was thoughtful, introspective, and burdened by memories that never quite faded. In many ways, Gentile symbolized something larger than one man's achievements. He represented a generation that came of age under fire, that grew up faster than they ever should have, and carried the emotional toll of that transformation for the rest of their lives. He was a product of the era, but also an exception. Few achieved as much as he did in so little time. Fewer still did it with the same unshakable commitment and relentless drive. After his passing, the United States Air Force carefully preserved his legacy. His service record remains one of the most decorated among fighter pilots of the European theater. His distinguished flying crosses, the Silver Star, Air Medals, and Distinguished Service Cross were not just earned, they were lived. They represented close calls, gut-wrenching decisions, and moments where split-second choices meant life or death, not just for him, but for others in the air with him. But what has truly endured about Don Gentile is how he has been remembered, not just as a name in a book or a face in a frame, but as a living part of aviation culture. The jet pilots who took to the air in Korea and Vietnam, the test pilots who broke sound barriers, and even modern drone operators studying combat doctrine, all of them walk paths carved by men like Gentile. His lessons enduring, training modules, simulator briefings, and the stories passed from instructor to cadet. In Pica, his hometown, his name lives on in plaques and school programs that continue to teach local kids about the quiet hero who once called their town home. In the Air Force, his memory is etched into the traditions of the 4th Fighter Wing, which traces its lineage to Gentile's old unit in museums across America. His story is told through nose art, uniforms, and replica Mustangs. Some of those aircraft still fly in air shows today, roaring across the sky in tribute to the golden age of fighter aviation and the men who defined it. But perhaps the most powerful legacy is the personal one. For every pilot who felt fear in the cockpit but pushed through it anyway, for every crew member who trusted their escort to keep them safe over hostile skies, for every young aviator staring out at a runway and imagining what could be. Don Gentile's spirit lives on. He once said, "I didn't go up there to get medals. I went up there to do a job." That job, that sense of duty, never left him, even in peacetime, when there were no enemy planes. He flew with purpose. He took risks not for glory, but for mastery, for a connection to the sky that few could understand, but many admired. Don Gentile died young, but in 30 years, he lived a life so intense, so filled with purpose and legacy, that his name still soars nearly a century later. His story is not just one of war, it's one of courage, discipline, and devotion. It's about the price of greatness, the loneliness of fame, and the eternal allure of the open sky. And when we speak of aces, of legends, of those who changed the course of air combat, we still look to the image of a young man in a leather flight jacket, leaning against a silver P-51 with a red nose and the name Shangri-La painted on the side. We still hear the echo of engines, feel the chill of altitude, and remember that once, high above a world at war, Don Gentile flew faster, fought harder, and dared more than most ever would.